In a lot of trading card games with a normal mana system, a key part of deck building is your mana curve. A mana curve shows how much mana all your cards cost relative to the other costs. There are 3 different types of mana curves. Most decks in these types of games fall under the low curve, with mostly 1 to 2 mana cards, because the earlier you can play cards, the more options you have. There is also a mid-range curve where it peaks at 3 to 4 mana. Then lastly is high mana curves, which have a ton of cards that cost at least 5 mana. But how does this relate to Vanguard? Vanguard doesn't have a mana system or limit of how many cards you could play in a turn. This video is going over how this theory could be applied to your deck building and make you way more aware of how decks function. So to understand your deck's mana curve, we must first understand how to evaluate a card's theoretical mana cost in Vanguard. The first thing is to not think about mana as in the literal cost of the card, but warp the idea to thinking, when is this card most effective? This one change in thinking allows us to evaluate cards more effectively. A great comparison I use is Forktail and Rock or Gore. Let's start with Forktail. At a baseline, Forktail is a grade 1, so it could be played on the first turn of the game. Its effect also activates when it is placed with no other restrictions. So altogether, Forktail is a low mana curve card because it could be played on the first turn and it is at maximum value. In comparison, there is Rock or Gore. Rock or Gore is a grade 2 unit, and when it attacks a grade 3 or higher unit, if you have 4 more different grades in Soul, it gets plus 10k power for the turn. It also has the effect that when you Soul Blast 4 more at the same time from your Vanguard's ability, and the opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or higher, you can Counterblast 1 to restand Rock or Gore. So Rock or Gore at a base level could be played on your second turn since it is grade 2. But during that time, it is a vanilla since your opponent needs to be grade 3 or greater to use either of its effects. If you go first, then they will be grade 1, and if you go second, they will be grade 2. So how you need to think about Rock or Gore is that it's not really a turn 2 card. If you go first, then the earliest it can use its effects is turn 4, because when you hit grade 3, your opponent will still be grade 2. If you go second though, the earliest it can be used is turn 3, since the opponent will be grade 3 when you reach grade 3 yourself. Understanding all of that, we can come to the conclusion that Rock or Gore is a high mana cost card. Now, the interesting thing to note with Vanguard compared to other games is that all cards have a baseline ability of being able to be used as shield, which can make them low mana cards. Since we understand card evaluation now, we could take a look at curves as a whole deck. I'll use some examples of some recent decks showing different types of curves. First up, I'm starting with the Shoujo Doji list from my last How to Play video. Shoujo Doji is interesting because some cards have effects that could be used early, while also having extra bonuses later on. This curve shows that the deck has a ton of power when it reaches grade 3. It has cards like Unprecedented, Tsukuyo Dachi, and Kinrin, which aren't fully live till you reach your grade 3 Shoujo Doji. It also has some cards that could be used early, like Ogi Jishi and Izazawa for the search effects. But they also have bonus effects while you're on grade 3 since they can be put into soul from Shoujo Doji. This type of curve is a mid-range curve. Here are some other decks that typically have this type of curve. After that, we have Sacrifice Glass. Sacrifice Glass's curve is very top heavy. Almost all of its cards require you to be on grade 3 or utilize the energy Glass generates in order to use their effects. The only early game card in this deck is Tizcar, and it doesn't really add anything offensively. Then there is Grand Dogma, which is technically a card you can use turn 3, but isn't at full power till turn 5 when it can restand as well. For this example, I am putting it in turn 3 since we still have a decent bit of its effect and we want to be actively using it on turn 3. But you can also think of it as a turn 4 or turn 5 card. What we can understand from this curve though is that Glass likes to slow the game pace down since its power comes in during the really late stages of the game. This is a late game curve. Here are some other examples of decks that follow this type of curve. And then lastly, we have Undercover. Undercover has a low mana curve. It has multiple cards where the primary effect is usable in the first 2 turns. This gives Undercover a ton of options throughout the early game compared to most decks. It has a ton of tutoring ability from the effects that the deck can have in early game while setting up for their later turns. Here are some other examples of low mana curves. Now, having this information in your disposal, you can build decks and understand game plans a lot easier. Typically, decks with lower curves are faster, and decks with higher curves are slower. With all that being said, there is still one major thing seen in a lot of mana curves that we have yet talked about, and that is you hitting the subscribe button. I put in a lot of effort in editing and scripting these videos, and I would love to keep focusing on making this type of content. In order for that to happen though, I really need to see people enjoying it. If you'd like to support even further, you can become a member and get access to more vids from me. It is actually ramping. Ramping is the ability to go through your mana curve faster by skipping other parts of your mana curve. The easiest examples are cards like Wild Growth in Hearthstone, Rampant Growth in Magic, and Dragon's Oracle in Shadowverse Evolved. These cards are your typical 2 mana spells that ramp 1 mana. So if you see these cards on 2 mana, then you essentially spend your whole 2 mana turn to skip your 3 mana turn and go straight to your 4 mana turn on your next turn. Ramping brings a very cool aspect where it allows access to higher cost cards sooner. Again, in Vanguard though, it isn't so clear on what classifies as ramp, but it very much exists in specific decks. A primary example is Ezel. The grade 2 in the ride line, Bowmains, reads that if your soul has a Gareth and a Criff, you can discard a card to superior ride Ezel from your ride deck with drive -1. Superior riding into a higher grade, also known as ride skipping, allows you to access higher grades sooner. So any cards that are grade 3 or specify that you need an Ezel Vanguard will be usable on your second turn every single game. This power level jump is really impactful in Vanguard, especially when this deck goes first. When it goes first, then it will be grade 3 versus the opponent's grade 1. This goes even further by allowing the deck to access Persona Ride a turn earlier as well. It sounds broken at first, but there is a real cost to this. For one, Bowmains requires you to discard a card, and it minuses a drive from Ezel when you ride it. So overall, this nets you no additional cards for the turn in comparison to just staying on grade 2 and getting that drive check. Ezel himself also has a multi-attack skill that requires your opponent to be grade 3. So this deck has no good way to go beyond 3 attacks till the opponent catches back up to grade 3. Some other examples of current standard decks that do this are all of the grade 4 decks that have cards that allow them to ride skip to grade 4. The first of which being Amelia with Mahar Nirvana. If you'd like to see more on that, check out my history of the overdress mechanic video after this. And then another primary example of ramp that multiple decks have access to are mask units. Mask units are alternate forms of other units, and if the opponent is grade 3 or greater, you can utilize the order card Mask of Hydrogram to Persona Ride into a mask unit. This is huge because the mask player will always reach Persona Ride first compared to the opponent. This is another kind of ramp which allows a deck to use its game mechanics sooner than normal. Some other examples in other formats is in Premium, the recent History Collection erratas allow you to stride sooner, and also a banned card New Dio did this. Or there's also cards in V Premium that give you bonus gift markers as well. All these types of effects are considered ramping. For the mask units though, you have a huge deck building cost to be able to consistently utilize Mask of Hydrogram. You need 4 of the mask unit, at least 2 Mask of Hydrogram, and usually 4 of the grade 2 Dragon Tree Wretch that searches for the Mask of Hydrogram. So at minimum, you need to spend 10 slots of your deck in order to access this mechanic, which is a lot when you also have to spend 20 other slots for triggers and sentinels, leaving the deck with only 20 more card slots it can work with for other cards, while any other deck has 30 slots. For ramp, most decks don't actually have access to ramp, which is a pretty normal thing in most other card games as well. The decks that do, though, have pros and cons and different costs to them. And that's all for mana curves. If you found this interesting or have any additional input, please comment down below. And that's it. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you guys in the next one.